Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I hope everybody is enjoying their COP28 experience so far. Big thank you to our panelists for being here as well. Welcome to a discussion on carbon dioxide removal, or as some of us call it, CDR. My name is Amy Harder. I'm executive editor of Cypher News, a media outlet dedicated to covering climate solutions, and I'm looking forward to moderating this conversation. Carbon removal has rapidly become one of the most talked about and controversial set of climate solutions in just the past few years. With our panel today, we are seeking to unpack why it's important and to address some of those challenges and concerns. First, a quick general definition. Carbon removal refers to various methods, both technology and nature-based, of capturing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it for decades to millennia in the land, ocean, and geological formations. And although they're often conflated, carbon removal is technically separate from point source carbon capture, and we'll mostly be focusing on carbon removal in this conversation, but of course, the two are interlinked in our climate debate, and we will be mentioning both. So with that, I will introduce our esteemed panelists. We have Bill Gates, founder of Breakthrough Energy and co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We have Brad Smith, vice chair and president of Microsoft. Arun Majumdar, inaugural dean of the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. And joining us shortly in that last chair will be president of Kenya, William Ruto. Let's give our panelists a quick intro round of applause. So we've been hearing a lot from the United Nations and others that the world is on track for a warming of 2.5 degrees Celsius or more, overshooting the Paris Agreement goals of limiting such rise to 2 degrees to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And Bill, you've been emphasizing this as well in some of your remarks while you've been here in Dubai. In that context, how do you see carbon removal in relation to this current trajectory?
Well, every ton we remove means we're heating the planet less. It's complex for some of these methods to do the accounting, but you get it out of the atmosphere and you get less warming. The ideal would be for almost every type of emissions activity to re-engineer it so there are no emissions. Steel, cement, cars, trucks, planes. And, there's a lot of great work going on in that. Breakthrough Energy is one of the big funders of that. We had a great announcement yesterday where Breakthrough Energy Catalyst is helping to fund an e-methanol plant, which will take shipping emissions and start to get on a scale curve that would make that economic enough that for that sector, ideally, we wouldn't have to talk about emissions at all because it's green methanol. And so, we're not going to solve all the emissions, or I'd say even at most 10 to 15% of emissions with carbon removal. Even at 10%, the scale is very large. But I'd point out 3 areas where carbon removal will be probably necessary. The first is that if we overshoot the temperature increase that we want to achieve, carbon removal moves you back down. And almost every forecast that hits 1.5 or even most that hit 2 nowadays have those negative years. Those negative years, that's carbon removal. Another challenge is that because it's a global problem, it's not only every source of emission, it's every country. And so if you say to somebody, when will Russia get to zero emissions? I don't think there's a clear answer to that. We could have a number of countries, either because they're poor enough or they're just not engaged in this issue, where they continue to emit. And so to get to zero, you've got to offset that with CDR. A final possibility, and Eric and I were discussing this yesterday, is that if hydrogen became very, very cheap, and we don't know that it will, but if it did, and you could pull in carbon very inexpensively, then you can do what's called completing the fuel cycle. And so you're just making fuel from today's carbon, not historic carbon, and that means that you're at net zero emissions. And so I think it's the number of entrepreneurs in this space is fantastic. You know, the IRA bill gave some support for people to come together. You know, you've got often you have the contactor piece, you have the chemistry, you have the pressurization and storage. There's a lot of different pieces. So, you know, to see companies trying to get these costs down so that we have this as an option and for, you know, getting rid of some of the emissions today, you know, I think it's fantastic.
Brad, I want to turn to you. Among corporations, Microsoft has really been at the forefront of this technology. Why are you investing so much in this space when there isn't necessarily a direct line between your bottom line and this type of technology? Why do you see it as such an important investment?
Well, it turns out we live on the same planet as everybody else. And, you know, in a sense, I find it fascinating that there is sometimes this controversy about carbon removal. And the controversy makes sense if it's a question of or. You know, does one reduce emissions or have carbon removal? In which case the or becomes a V, you know, it's carbon reduction versus carbon removal. But the right way to think about it, and I think Bill really laid the foundation for it, is it's an and. We need to do both. And especially when you think about overshooting, the only way to correct for that is then to remove more. And I just would say at the outset, for those of you who I would say are the youngest in the audience, I think you should hope that there will be some decade in your future, let's just say COP in the 2070s, when the planet as a whole might be carbon negative. We'd so drive down emissions and then we have carbon removal that we're actually able as a species to reverse some of the effects of climate change. That should be our dream and our vision. Well, we do live in the here and now, and you know, we're focused on the 2020s. And you know, we have definitely added it to a broad portfolio of what we're doing across Microsoft. So we're incredibly focused on driving down our emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, electricity, concrete, you know, steel, fuel, et cetera. We have plans for every one of those, and we know where we're short and where we know where we need to do better. And we're very committed to carbon removal. So just 18 months ago at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, we were one of 3 companies, we joined Salesforce and Google, in committing that we would be CDR champions as part of the First Movers Coalition. And so we at Microsoft committed that we would contract for $200 million of high durability carbon removal. And the good news is, you know, what we're announcing here at COP is we've done that. You know, we're the first company to put in place contracts for that $200 million. It doesn't buy you as many tons as you would like, because if you want to really remove carbon with high durability, it's very expensive. But this is how you create a market. And I think one of the reasons we are so focused on doing this is it is a place where tech companies can help build new markets. One of the first contracts we entered into was with a company called Climeworks, and it was really the first commercial direct air capture solution. They're based in Switzerland. But our biggest contract that we've just entered into is with Ørsted for more than 2.5 million tons of carbon removal. So you're just starting to see the building blocks laid for what can emerge as a solution over time. And the prices need to come down, but you can't bring the prices down until you get the technology moving forward.
Price is definitely an important point, and we are going to come back to that. Arun, I want to turn to you. You were founding director of the United States Advanced Research Projects Agency, more commonly known as ARPA-E, in 2009. So you have been on the leading edge of new technologies longer than probably everybody in this room. How have you seen carbon removal evolve and come into this conversation over the last decade?
Well, I think there have been people involved in this even longer. People like David Keith, Klaus Slackner, others. In fact, I found myself in a committee of the American Physical Society to write the first report on direct air capture which came out after I joined the DOE, that came out in 2011, which did the first analysis of what the cost is likely to be, doing all the chemical engineering and the chemistry involved. And it turned out to be, we had predicted that it's going to be around $500, $600 a ton. In fact, when you look at Climeworks, the first cost was at roughly that. And then, of course, you need them. So glad to hear that Microsoft is investing in it to create the market, because without that, it's very hard to bring the cost down the learning curve. And if you can get to about, right now it's about $200, $300. If you can get to about 100, maybe even lower, then it becomes really interesting in terms of scalability. And I think that's where, so there's a long history in this, but it was, a few people who saw it, who foresaw this. But now, of course, it's in the public discourse right now. And I would just endorse what has been said, that this is not an either or. If you look at all the studies of IPCC, there's, I don't know how many National Academies reports that have come out where you have this 50-odd gigatons of decarbonization that you got to do by mid-century or maybe a little bit longer. But you got this, below the zero, there's this patch out there which is 10 gigatons roughly per year of, and the rate is important, 10 gigatons roughly of negative emissions, right? And it's not an either or, and I think we should dispel that myth that this is something else. And that is, we got to do and.
I want to bring in the International Energy Agency, which has really become a leader in the climate space, despite being founded upon oil security. It issued a report in May of this year that found that carbon removal is an essential part of addressing climate change and seeking net zero by 2050. At the same time, just last week, the IEA issued a report criticizing the oil industry for, quote, excessive expectations and reliance on carbon capture. And I inferred that as mostly referring to point source carbon capture, although the report was a little bit vague by my reading of it. I would love to hear from the panelists, and Bill, perhaps we can start with you. How do you distinguish between carbon removal technologies and point source carbon capture, and how do you think about them in our climate agenda?
I would say, direct capture, because your concentrations are higher, it's always going to cost a little bit less than direct air capture. But most of those places where you build up a lot of CO2, we'd like to change the engineering process so you don't have that CO2 at all, like an electric car versus an internal combustion engine, electric heat pump versus burning natural gas. That's how we're going to get 90% of the reduction. I remember there was a time when the coal industry ran ads about clean coal, and the government had a project not particularly successful because in that case, the energy and the difficulty with the pollutants and the flue gas of a coal plant, it just completely fell apart. And so even though it was sort of like, hey, let us keep doing coal, and there were different schemes, nothing came of it. With natural gas, it would be easier, but you'd have to have a carbon tax that would completely fund that. At, say, Climeworks prices, you'd double the price of gasoline, you'd be 6 times the price of cement. And to scale up, even just, where do you put it all, it'd be the size of the entire oil industry, which those things don't get built overnight. So yes, people who think this is the magic genie are misleading you. It is a piece for the hard part, and it's fantastic to have people like Microsoft buying it today because, there are definitely companies, breakthroughs in like Heirloom, 4401, Graphite, all amazing entrepreneurs that are working to get to 100 and below 100. And that would help. If you're doing 5 billion tons at $100, that's $500 billion. Somebody is paying for that. All foreign aid from rich countries to poor countries, all of it, health, education, is $140 billion a year. So you're talking about something that's more than, if that's your price and that's your scale, it's 3 times bigger than all foreign aid. So it's a significant number, not in terms of a percentage of the world economy or even potentially the damages, but the collective action problem is not easy to solve if that's the scale that you're pretending it's going to show up at.
Arun, how do you distinguish between point source carbon capture and direct air capture, in particular when it comes to the oil and gas industry?
Well, I think from I'll say a little bit about the removal part first, because it's important to understand that the lifetime of the CO2 molecules in the atmosphere in circulation is a few hundred years. So the CO2 molecules that were emitted in the past, going all the way to James Watt's engine, are probably still in circulation. So I think we have to clean our own garbage first, right? And there are other countries that have to develop, that are in a much earlier stage of development that will need some fossil fuels for the next few decades. And so we got to account so that the idea of removal is critical. It's not either or again. The question of point source comes in is there a replacement of the technology? And if there is a replacement of technology, for example, coal-fired power plants, well, solar and wind are cheaper today than that. Yes, the grid is not quite designed for it, but, and so installing solar and wind and nuclear would be a great way to address that, right? On the other hand, there are places like in cement, right? We have to make cement. There are emissions. And at that scale, there are new ways of doing cement today that have low emissions, but they're not at scale. So what do we do now, from now to the next in a few decades for these to scale? I think in those cases where we don't have alternatives, I think the point source makes a lot of sense. So I think you need both. Again, we don't have the luxury right now of either or in all of these cases. And the question is, can we bring down the cost of these questions so that the penalty that you pay is reduced?
Brad, what has been your experience? Obviously, Microsoft is focused on carbon removal. What are your observations about the oil and gas industry relying on point source carbon capture?
Well, I would say two things. And again, I just think this is a classic case where you need a number of ingredients to make something, and then people get entirely fixated on one ingredient and they argue about it. And yeah, if we just put it in context, for me, it's not really, we're not as focused on the oil and gas, but if you just step back, first you have to ask, is it something you'd like to see the world continue? And we might say, well, we see a point in time in the future when we don't want to see coal used to generate power, or we don't want to see perhaps oil and gas used. But do we still want to have concrete? Yes, we do, I think, unless something emerges that will be better for building strong buildings. And so that's where you do want point source removal. And that is an example of something where we are actually quite involved and focused and funding a company like Carbon Cure. And we'll apply the same approach to this that we brought to direct air capture, what the world has brought to electricity with PPAs. If we can build a world where you can actually get your concrete from somebody who's been involved in point source removal, that's a good thing. And if it's not possible and you can contribute to a market more broadly to expand that kind of removal, I'll argue that's a good thing. Now, we still need the other kinds of removal, and the beauty of direct air capture is, I take your point, we need to clean up our garbage. Well, our garbage in this case is in the air, and it turns out the air is everywhere. At the same time, direct air capture, at least at this point, can't quite work everywhere because you've got to be able to remove the carbon and then deposit it deep underground one way or another. And there are some parts of the world where there are geological formations in close proximity to where you would remove the carbon and then you deposit it, at least at a somewhat lower cost. So I just think you want to be doing multiple things, which is what we're trying to ask ourselves. Where can we contribute? What can we advance? Direct air capture. And then something like concrete, we can address both of those things, at least to the extent that we're spending our money to advance that.
To crystallize the the trash metaphor. So it sounds like we need to start putting less trash into the garbage, but then we have to remember we have a big pile of garbage already, and we don't want it to stink for the next millennial, so we should try to get rid of it. So it is definitely an and. A quick update. Unfortunately, President Ruto will not be able to join us, but I do want to spend a few minutes focused on sort of the role of carbon removal technologies for lower income countries. So Bill, I want to turn to you and talk about, and ask you, your interest in climate change, and I'm sure many of you in the room have heard this from Bill, that your interest started from what you saw in the lower income countries and the impacts of a warming world there. And of course, so now you focus on adaptation largely at the foundation and mitigation at Breakthrough Energy. Can you talk about how you see carbon removal bridging both mitigation and adaptation, particularly in lower income countries?
Well, the people who are dramatically affected by climate change are the poor people living near the equator. It will have a substantial effect on their life. That part is not overwrought. It's happening today with more crop failures. And Africa had a challenge of population growth and drying soils even before you put climate change on top of that. The Green Revolution, which improved the key cereal crops, wheat, maize, and rice, actually never got to Africa. Africa, their ecosystems, even for those three crops, are different, and they use a higher variety: sorghum, millet, cassava. And so we owe it to them under this adaptation heading to make great progress. And so President Ruto says, look, any way you can help me have less drought, I'm all for it. I'm not going to get religious about this. One nice thing would be if we could actually do the carbon removal as an economic thing in Africa. For some of the techniques, getting the right amount of green electricity could be a challenge, but there are places there that might work. The graphite approach is different enough that I think it makes sense to try that out in Africa, so you could create economic activity there. But if you want to see the face of climate change, yes, you can go see it in various natural ecosystems, but the human face of it is the subsistence farmers in Africa.
We've talked a lot about price, and of course, price is everything here, and making it more affordable for all of us here, but most importantly, in lower income countries. So we'd love to kind of dig into that a little bit more with all three of you. And Bill, I want to start with you. Why is the green premium, as you call it, so difficult to bring down with carbon removal technologies?
Well, hydrocarbons are pretty magical. Civilization is built on energy intensification. And Smeal educates us how fundamental hydrocarbons are to modern society. And it's not just hydrocarbons. People like to talk about oil and gas, but it's cement and meat. And there are many sources of emissions, fertilizer, that are not due to the oil and gas industry. Sometimes it's like if we just get rid of those guys, then magically this conspiracy would end and it would all be okay. So you've got such a range of emissions. The reason I push on zero green premium is that most emissions are from middle-income countries, and asking them to slow down their development to pay higher prices for green products, it's just not going to work. They're going to ask for subsidies. We're not going to come up with those subsidies. I thought the point about the historical emissions in the U.S. is a very good one. We sort of owe it to the world to get back to the world average of per capita emissions, and that's a lot of carbon capture right there, just to have us not be the historic emitters who channels this problem. So I'm thrilled that in almost every area, at least at the lab level, there are new processes that, once they get scaled out, have a good chance of having a zero green premium. And so if the rich countries, rich companies, rich individuals do their part, then that scaling is taken care of. And the middle income countries simply, okay, they have to accelerate adoption. They may have to phase out a cement plant before the end of its lifetime, but you're not asking them to substantially reduce their use of cement, which is not for mansions, it's for basic roads and shelter.
Brad, you really are in the thick of it from the corporate world, trying to bring down that the cost and scale it up. Can you talk about your experience specifically on price, and what are you paying now, and what do you hope to pay in 20 years?
Well, what we're paying now is a high price. I mean, if we can get $100 for sustainable aviation fuel, that's a good price. I mean, it's even more. Talking about the prices for something like direct air capture. We're in a good industry to think about this for two reasons. One is we can afford it, to be honest. But second, look, I started at Microsoft 30 years ago when Bill was the CEO. And if you went back and you looked at what somebody was paying for memory, for RAM, for computing power, the prices were extraordinary. When Bill coined the phrase "a computer on every desk and in every home," nobody could imagine it being small enough, but nobody could imagine it being cheap enough to get a computer. So, there's two things that we have learned every year that Microsoft has been in business. First, you got to invent the technology. And second, you need the economic equation to bring the cost of the technology down. And what that fundamentally means is you need early investors that are willing to pay more. And then you need to send the market signal that builds a market with a sufficient scale that the economics start to bring prices down. So that's what we're doing. And I applaud all of our competitors. I mean, the whole industry for tech is doing it, which is fantastic. And ultimately, over time, the thing we're all going to need to think more about is how do you actually encourage more purchasing of something like removal when in some ways it's the ultimate free rider syndrome. You take a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere, everyone on planet Earth benefits. And so, we'll find that as sort of part of the discipline that will emerge as well, I think, for public policy and the like.
Arun, I know you're an advisor to Frontier. That's a consortium of companies working to buy carbon removal credits to help scale the technology and bring down the price. And of course, you're also working on that at Stanford. Can you talk about your experience on bringing down the cost?
Well, I think it's similar to what Microsoft is trying to do, is to create the first market. But I want to also add to the discussion of cost. I think it's very important not to lose sight of scale, because these technologies have to be scalable to the gigaton per year. So if you take the DAC, the direct air capture, today, and I'll just give it, anything you do with CO2 removal or conversion needs energy. And that's just the laws of physics, laws of thermodynamics. You cannot violate them, no matter what people want to do, right? So you ask the question, so how far are we from the theoretical limit of today's DAC, right? It's roughly about factor of 15 to 20 times higher than the theoretical limit. Now, you cannot be at the theoretical limit because nothing moves. So you got to be about a factor of 4 or 5. So we have a factor of 3 to 4 remaining to go in terms of bringing the energy intensity down of this direct air capture. Even if you do that, you will need zero carbon heat or some kind of zero carbon energy on the order of few thousand terawatt hours per year to be able to do direct air capture gigaton. So talking about Kenya or some other country, if they have the resources for that energy, whether it is enhanced geothermal or whether it is, and I really hope Eric and Bill are wildly successful in this this natural hydrogen, because that becomes a source. And you don't want to move the hydrogen, it's very expensive, but if you can put a DAC with the hydrogen out there, why not? Because that provides the energy. Otherwise, I worry that if you don't have the energy source, these DACs may look good right now, they may not scale, right? On the other hand, if you take agriculture, right, and you ask the question, Bill talked about sorghum and all the other food sources. if you look at the grains today, roughly half the crop is food and the other half is waste, okay? And we don't do much. In many parts of the world, they're burnt, right? The CO2 goes away. That's the cheapest way to renew the field. On the other hand, if you ask the question, how much annually CO2 from the atmosphere has been stored in that, it's on the order of 10 gigatons of CO2 per year. Now, if you could find a way, like graphite or some other ways, to do that, and you give certainty, as Eric pointed out yesterday, then maybe that's a revenue stream for the farmers who desperately need some other revenues besides. So I think one has to think about co-benefits. In that case, the energy came from sunlight. CO2 is at 420 ppm. It's completely distributed. You need a distributed source of energy, and then you already got it. And so I think one has to think creatively of co-benefits, of how to scale, et cetera, in addition to the cost.
You make some great points. And just to name check the Eric, who has been mentioned a few times, Eric Toon, the Chief Technology Officer of Breakthrough Energies, here in the front row. Yeah, he and Bill had a great chat yesterday about many of these same topics. Arun, thank you for mentioning the immense energy needs of DAC, which is one of the most talked about types of carbon removal technologies. Climeworks, one of the leading companies in this space, is exploring such a facility in Kenya precisely because of that country's ample geothermal resources. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. In our concluding final moments, would love to do a lightning round word association. And so I would like for you to say the first word or short phrase that pops into your head when I say the following words. And the first one is trees.
Good.
Only say good things about them.
Good trees.
Good trees, good.
I love running through trees, so that's what I would say. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, more commonly known as BECCS. Its acronym.
More.
Yes.
Bill, you are nodding your head, so what's your word?
Graphite.
And traditional carbon offsets?
Less good.
There's some work to be done. It's fantastic that people are participating, but we got to get the accounting to be more rigorous.
Careful, reduce uncertainty.
And our final one, what is one word that you would use to summarize carbon removal?
Necessary.
Essential.
Difficult.
With that, I want to a big thank you to our esteemed panelists and to the audience for joining us.